All right, wow, the AP exam is almost here. It is just around the corner. And this video today is going to help you prepare for that so that you can get that 3, 4, or ideally 5 on your upcoming exam. Now, AP Seminar is one of the courses that has an exam. Unlike AP Research, where you're just submitting a paper, there's a lot of moving parts that go into AP Seminar. 2 papers, 2 presentations, and an exam? Yes. But this video is going to tell you what to expect, how to prepare, and make sure that you score well. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Let's step back and just look at how do we get AP credit in this course? How are things weighted? So if we take a look at the different AP components, there's really 3 sequences. The first sequence being the IRR, the research report, and the TMP, oh, we love the group project. That together comes for a 20% of your AP score, and then from there you move on to your individual written argument. And then of course the IMP, which is basically a presentation version of that. Now, if you want to learn more about overview of how this course works, there's a video I have that goes into a lot more detail about that. Not to mention there is curriculum that can support you year long, so feel free to check that out. But those 2 pieces together, those performance tasks, that only adds up to 55%. Now, that's significant, but that leaves 45% of your total AP score for that 2-hour exam, more or less. And so that can be really nerve-wracking, but this video is going to help you understand what to know about that. You have the part A and the part B, and I'm going to walk through both. Now, as a reminder, when you think about the IRR, IWA, TMP, IMP, it's good to remember that your teacher is going to be the one directly grading those presentations. So that is already going to be inputted into the College Board systems, but those papers are being graded by an anonymous grader who works for the College Board. So that's also very important to consider. And the same is true for the exam. The exam is also going to be graded by one of these graders who are experts in this course and will do their best to make sure you get an equitable grade, and of course anonymously. So that's a really good way to know where you stand. But let's go ahead and talk about it. We've got part A, part B. Before you freak out, let me try to just summarize each of these parts as simply as possible. Part A is about analyzing an argument. What is this op-ed or this opinion piece arguing? How does the author use the evidence to support the claims that build this argument? Part B, if you remember nothing from this video, I want you to remember this. Part B is a mini IWA. It's much of the same skills and approaches that you took to your individual written argument, but in a truncated form. So you get 4 stimulus texts, more or less, that all share a shared theme. You want to be inspired by that theme, but then write a argument. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start by taking a look at part A. Okay, let's talk about part A. Now, part A is supposed to be taking you about 30 minutes as opposed to part B, which they suggest 90 minutes. I think there's some wiggle room there. My students often spend maybe 5 or 10 more on part A, but 30 minutes is the recommendation. Here's what you have to do in 30 minutes. You are given a text. You've got to read this text. Now, these texts can range on any number of topics, but they generally are all sort of op-eds that take about a page or a page and a half. Once you've read it, and I would recommend while you're reading it, keep an eye out for claims and specific pieces of evidence, because you're going to have to use those. But once you've read it, the first thing you're supposed to do is you are supposed to identify the author's argument, main idea, or thesis. Now, this is more or less what is the overall argument in here. But it's important that you make sure you're identifying clearly all the pieces it may contain. So for example, one year there was an article about greed, and I'm going to reference this one quite often. And in this paper, they talked and argued about how greed has been sort of essential for driving the economy, but it's detrimental for our health as humans. Now, a bunch of my students just wrote, greed is good for the economy. And then the other half wrote, greed is detrimental for people's health. The students who got all three of the available points were the ones who were able to synthesize that. Greed, although an essential feature of driving the consumer economy, has detrimental effects on our health. Notice how long that is. Not particularly long. In fact, you want to be able to knock this out in 1 to 3 sentences max. If you're going over 3 sentences, I think you're actually going too long. And so the clear thing you want to do here is quickly identify the author's argument. You don't have to go into the evidence. Just go ahead and support what they're saying, that main idea. 1 to 3 sentences. Okay, so that is the first question in part A. Once you've gone from there, the second one I think is the most time consuming. If we just want to think of it in terms of length, this is going to take you between 2 to 4 paragraphs. Honestly, you could go more, but remember, you're only supposed to do 30 minutes here. And so anything more than 4, I think, is actually going to cut too much into your time. Here, what the College Board says is you should do 2 things, really. Number 1, explain the author's line of reasoning by identifying the claims used to build the argument. So 1, identify claims and explaining the connections between them. Okay, identify claims and explain connections between them. Now, you are not writing poetry here. I highly recommend be as specific and explicit as possible. The first claim the author uses to build their argument is, this connects to the next claim by X, Y, and Z. So for example, in that one exam where they had this article about greed being good, you might synthesize by saying the first claim that the author lays out is that greed is a fuel for driving our consumer economy. Then you might explain. In this claim, the author uses data that shows that consumer demand for items is not correlated with need, but rather reflects a desire to accumulate or compete with one another. Sociologists, Okay, you explain those pieces of evidence that support that claim. At the end of that paragraph, you're going to want to quickly turn that around and say, this claim forms the foundation and connects to the next claim by showing how it's essential to the economy. The second claim here shows the side effects of this essential aspect of the consumer economy. The second claim is that although greed is good for the economy, it has negative impacts on people's mental health. This claim builds this argument by showing us statistics of people's unhappiness not increasing once they get a certain amount of material conditions, etc. What I have done there is I've identified now 2 claims, but I've explained the connection. This first claim is the foundation upon which they complicate this process, or this first claim shows the benefit. This next claim shows one of the downsides. You have to have that connecting piece explained. Otherwise, you're just going to have a list of claims. The first claim is greed benefits the economy. The second claim is greed harms people. The third claim is greed can be... We don't want to do that. We actually have to build and reflect back to the greater sort of how the author puts together their argument. I hope that's helpful. We could probably talk a lot more about this, but we will dive in and look at some examples. Let's get to the third question. So the first question, it should be done in 1 to 3 sentences. The second one, it should be done in 2 to 4 paragraphs. I've never seen an article that has less than 3 or 4 claims in it. So it's possible that there's going to be multiple claims. You got to get at least more than 2, okay? I would say if you have less than 3, you might be in the danger zone there. Let's talk about question 3. Question number 3 deals directly with evidence. And here it says, evaluate the effectiveness of the evidence the author uses to support the claims made in the argument. Let's just quickly make sure we're on the same page about what is the relationship between the main argument, claims, and evidence. I want you to think of a table. Now, a table, it has a function, right? It supports it, me putting my computer here, et cetera, et cetera. The table is the big idea, right? It has 4 legs. It gets supported. That's your main argument. Now, the claims are the reasons that hold up this table, right? These are the ways you build this argument, the way the table stands. I want you to think of the evidence as sort of what goes into it. It's the material, it's the wood, it's the molecules that stick together in each of these legs to hold up your general argument. Okay, there's my analogy. But more or less, the main argument is what you encounter as the function of the article. The reasons or the claims are what support the main argument. And then the evidence is what builds into those claims and makes your argument reliable and gives it a degree of credibility. And those 2 aspects are how you want to be evaluating evidence in the 3rd question. We want to evaluate in regards to credibility and reliability. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now for this, I think you should probably do 2 paragraphs. You could do 2 to 3. I tell my students often, let's have you evaluate the evidence in 1 paragraph of evidence you find strong, and then another paragraph of evidence that you find lacking or somewhat problematic. This is an easy way to structure your response. And then maybe you have a mini summary, maybe 2 or 3 sentences at the top or at the beginning or at the end that sort of synthesizes how you feel about the argument or the evidence rather in relation to the argument. So for example, let's say you have a piece of evidence that talks about a sociologist who did a study over 25 years looking at people's income and their level of happiness. They find that as income increases, happiness increases to a point. And as income continues to increase, happiness no longer increases. Now, what you want to do here is you don't need to explain the argument again, right? You're just dealing with evidence. So here I might say something like, one of the pieces of evidence that I find convincing and the author uses effectively is a study that was conducted by a sociologist, John Smith. This is a very credible piece of evidence because John Smith is mentioned as being a psychologist at Harvard University, a prestigious university, and not only do they name his credentials, but they talk about some of the details of the study so that I can see exactly how much went into this study and how reliable its findings may be. Boom. I have taken a specific piece of evidence. I haven't said the study was effective. No, I've explained specifically which piece of evidence I'm talking about, and then I've taken it to town with those 2 criteria, relevance and credibility. That's how you do it. You should be as specific as possible. The reader doesn't, or the grader rather, is not going to read between the lines to try to figure out which piece of evidence. Again, we're not writing poetry. We want to say explicitly what piece of evidence. The study that is mentioned from 2008. Well, what about a weak piece of evidence, right? Well, here you might cite something like, in the source, they mention someone who was interviewed, although they don't establish who they were, and this really functions as an antidote. Now, this antidote falls flat because we don't know where it's coming from, and thus we don't have a sense of its credibility and reliability, and we simply have to trust that the journalist talked to someone who may have been knowledgeable about this situation. There we go. College Board doesn't care if student A says this piece of evidence is great and student B says this piece of evidence is not great. It's all about how effective are you in evaluating it. I might evaluate a piece of evidence as not so great, and you might take the same piece of evidence and you explain well why you find it to be effective. So that in its core are those three pieces there. All right, let's talk about the rubric, because what you really should be focused on here in prepping is getting familiar with the rubric. If you don't do that, you don't know what you're being evaluated for, and then I think you might run the risk of thinking you're nailing it where you're really off. So let's take a look at the rubric row by row. Now, row number 1 correlates with the first question. Here it says understand and analyze argument. Let's look at the low. The response misstates the author's argument, main idea, or thesis. This is where you actually didn't get it. Now, a 0 is blank, or it's not even clear what you're talking about. A 1 might be something, to go on this example of the greed being good, that says, greed is a horrible thing. Well, that's not really the argument. You're probably going to get a 1 for that. Now, number 2 says the response identifies in part or with some accuracy the author's main idea or thesis. This is like I talked about. This might be greed is good for the economy, but you haven't mentioned anything about its detriments for health, or vice versa. And then high, those 3 points accurately identifies the author's main argument, idea, or thesis. There is a right or wrong answer for question number 1. Okay, let's take a look at the second row. The second row here says understand and analyze argument. A 2, the lowest score here, is the response correctly identifies at least one of the author's claims. You only need to identify one of the author's claims and you've already gotten a 2. Now, what about a 4? 4 says the response provides a limited explanation of the author's line of reasoning by accurately identifying some of the claims. Notice it says claims, so this is 2 or more, and identifying the connections or acknowledging a relationship between them. Acknowledging a relationship between them is basically just you're headed in the direction of explaining how they connect, but you haven't really explained that connection. And then lastly, for 6 points here, the response provides a thorough explanation of the author's line of reasoning by identifying relevant claims and clearly explaining the connections between them. Okay, and finally, the last row, which is also worth up to 6 points, has to do with evidence. It says the response identifies little evidence, or it makes superficial reference to the relevance and credibility, but lacks explanation. You might say something like, the study about happiness and wealth wasn't very good. Okay, you've mentioned it, you've made superficial reference to it, you've even said it wasn't very good, so you're doing some evaluation, but there's really no meat on the bones here. Number 4 says the response explains various pieces of evidence, okay, multiple, more than 1, at least 2, in terms of credibility and relevance, but does so inconsistently or unevenly. Inconsistent, this is just, it's kind of mid, You're getting some, you got more than 2, or you got at least 2 that are done pretty well, but there's a lot to be desired. And then number 6 is the response evaluates the relevance and credibility and thoroughly evaluates how well the evidence is used to support the author's argument. This is a holistic taking a look at the evidence that really helps your reader understand how did they come to this conclusion based on the evidence, and how do these pieces of evidence work together with claims to support this argument. Okay, that's the rubric. More or less, main argument, identify claims and their connections, and evaluate evidence according to credibility and relevance. This is part A. Let's take a look at some examples. All right, like I had talked about here, we're going to look at this example from the 2017 exam. And in this, This is actually some prep material that the College Board has provided, but all of the things that you're seeing in terms of the slides and the spreadsheets, I do have curriculum that is available. For not just this unit, but all of the units, you're going to want to check that out. There's a link to it in the description. Okay, here's the student's response. This earned a 3. They said, the author argues that greed, despite its benefit to the economy, also is a detriment to human health. Both parts. The response earned a score of 3 because it identifies both parts and it acknowledges that greed, despite its benefit to the economy, does have a detriment to human health. Okay, there you go. Pretty straightforward. Let's move on to the second one. Now, before we read it, we're not going to read all of it. I want you to just look at the length. I count 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, 4 paragraphs, 5, 6. Okay, 6. That's quite long, but look at this paragraph. It's only like 2 or 3 sentences. Again, this is not poetry. You want to just go ahead and unpack this for the grader. Let's look at how this student puts it together. Here we go. The author establishes that growing levels of greed among American consumers is actually driving the economy. There it is, the first claim. He then acknowledges how damaging greed is to the human psyche. His line of reasoning is logical as it analyzes economic trends that support how greed has influenced consumerism, that it is largely unsupported by reliable sources. Wow, he's even synthesizing from some of his evaluation. You don't need to, but they're doing it here. The connections made between the subclaims are within reason because they follow the narrative of a changing American economy and address the consequences as they relate to this claim. This is a classic introduction paragraph. They're introducing the main argument, they're giving us a sense of what they think about it, and then here we go in. The author, Shoemaker, primarily analyzes the decline of happiness in relation to the rise of greed. He states that although people in the 1990s had better living conditions, more people are unhappy because of greed. Okay, notice that even in their explanation of the claims and the evidence, they're starting to actually discuss it with some evidence. This is another key move that lets your reader know that grader that you've really internalized it. Okay, I want you to skip down here where it says, this subclaim, although weakened by its lack of support, does connect to the claim that greed is hurting Americans while benefiting the American economy. The following subclaim is that, Okay, notice how it says the following subclaim. So the grader is like, oh, there it is, the next claim. They can easily see that. And I'm going to just go down here again. It says the subclaim is developed in the next paragraph where examples are given. Notice they keep saying claim, subclaim. They're directly talking about what to do. Now, if you want to read the rest of this, I've also have a link to this PDF that I've been using as I talk through this. Please do so. Okay, let's take a look at the third part here. Now, let's count the paragraphs again. One little opener. 2, 3, 4, 5, a little closer. I would say, realistically, this is like 3 paragraphs worth of what you're used to writing. Here's why it earned a 6. The response, which you are welcome to read, talks about the pieces of evidence and it uses those 2 things, credibility and relevance. So let's take a look at one example. The first example of evidence with no source is the reference to a wide range of studies in the intro that determines how greed is hurting happiness. However, this subclaim is saved by the reference to the General Survey of the United States. The credibility is not stated for the General Survey, but at least it has the suggestion of a national scope. Great. Now, I might have evaluated the same thing and said, general survey has national scope. This makes it strong. I can tell they've been looking, blah, 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 blah. This person is saying, we have the suggestion of a national scope. We don't have the author. Great. I love it. What they're doing is they're evaluating it in relation to its credibility and relevance. That's what you've got to do. All right. Together, this is going to be a significant portion of your exam. 3 points for the first question, 6 points for the claims and connections, and 6 points for the evidence. All right, let's move on and talk about Part B. All right, let's go ahead and talk about Part B. Now, Part B is supposed to take 3 times as long. So the recommended time here is 90 minutes. And like I said, it's a mini IWA. It is a miniature IWA. You get sources, you read the sources, you identify a theme that connects them and the different perspectives, and then you write an argument that is your own perspective on that theme or issue, so inspired by it. 90 minutes, this is Part B. This is the most time-consuming part because you really have to write a full essay. Now, you're obviously not going to write the full length of your IWA, but here is where I would say get as much as you can in here, and you should follow some of the more conventional guidelines of intro, body paragraphs, and conclusion. You might even want to address some limitations, alternate solutions even. This can reflect what you're used to in regards to writing your IWA. So let's talk about Part B. These sources can be long. I do think you should read these sources carefully. Yeah, maybe. You have to use 2 of them in your argument. So one thing I do is I tend to skim the 4 of the sources when I get it. I'm still reading. I'm definitely seeing graphs. I'm definitely reading intros, how it starts and how it ends. But I'm trying to maybe get a sense of that theme so then I know which 2 I'm going to use so I can focus more in on that. Now, if I was to make a mental prep map or I had scrap paper, I want to talk a little bit about what I would put down on the paper. Now, this is something I actually give my students, and we rehearse this using previous year's exams. And like I said earlier, if you want to see all my materials, even a full year's curriculum, there's a link in the bio if you're a teacher that's watching. But let's talk a little bit about what I give them. I give them this sheet, 1-pager, to go with it. So as they read these sources, the first thing they're asking is, what's the theme or issue? Now, there's nowhere on the exam where you have to write the theme is. No, there's not. But you will be able to tell if you're a grader whether that student has got it and whether they're in the right ballpark. Okay, the next question is, what is your argument based on the theme? Now, when you're moving from theme to argument, the important thing to remember is you have to add a topic or something specific. So if you're looking at these sources and you're noticing, okay, a theme that is emerging here is nostalgia. Now, that was one of the themes of the stimulus text a couple years back. And you're like, okay, do not write an essay that is nostalgia is important. Okay. And if one of the sources says something like, I don't know, like this year's sources, there's a source that talks about coffee shops being a third space. If that was one of your Part B sources and you write a essay for Part B that's like coffee shops are an important third space, you have essentially failed that row where you write something that is your own perspective, not the perspective represented in the sources. If you inversely were to write, a argument that says municipal government should fund community programs to support high schoolers because these community programs are important third spaces for connections in an isolated world, that's great. And then you can use that piece of evidence about coffee shops being an example of a third space where connections happen as an example of the sort of thing that you're arguing about. But you're not arguing about what the source is talking about. You are inspired by the source to pick a topic to then argue about. Then once you have an argument, you have to say, okay, which two sources am I going to use? Which are the best? Okay, this source I can use here for the context. This source actually is a really good example of one of my reasons, so I'll use this in one of my body paragraphs. Okay, what about the rest of it? Well, the rest of it you can use outside information. You can use more than two sources. It doesn't really matter as long as you end up using two sources from the stimulus text they provide you for Part B in a meaningful way. And so what I often ask my students to do is, okay, you've identified the theme, you've come up with a topic for your argument, or that is related but not just replicating one of the sources, and then you've come up with your two sources. The next thing you should do always when you're about to write is an outline. I like to do intro, which provides context, body paragraph 1, which is usually a reason, body paragraph 2, which is usually my second reason, body paragraph 3, maybe that's my third reason. And then in my conclusion, I might make recommendations, address limitations, synthesize, maybe I'll fortune tell what would happen if my recommendations are not taken. Something like this that does something more than simply summarizing, but it also synthesizes and summarizes at the same time. So I think we should maybe dive in and look at the rubric, right? Let's look at the rubric. Okay, for Part B, this has 4 rows. Unlike the first rubric for Part A, here there's also going to be some consideration of your conventions, your use of things like grammar, organization, etc. But let's start with the first row. The first row is worth 6 points and it's called Establish Argument. To earn 6 points, you have to do this. The response identifies a theme or issue connecting the provided sources and presents a perspective that is not represented in one of the sources, or brings a particularly insightful approach to one of the perspectives, or makes a strong thematic connection amongst the perspectives. 3 different ways to get that point. But it has to be a unique idea. It can have overlap in that Venn diagram, but it cannot simply reproduce one of the perspectives, right? It could be a super insightful connection, right? I would recommend keep it simple. Pick a topic that you can use these sources to support that is clearly not the topic of the source. Try to get concrete, like a should stakeholder do action in order to support other stakeholder, the impacted. Keep it simple. Graders grade a lot of these, and if they have to read through the nuance, they might miss your brilliance. Okay, medium. What gets a 4 versus a 6? The response identifies a theme or issue that connects the sources. The response derives its perspective from only one of the sources. Here you go. This is like you've seen a source like, oh, I'm going to write about this. And it's basically just based on that source versus really synthesizing and pulling out what you think the theme is and then connecting it to those two. A 2 is the response misstates or overlooks the theme and the perspective is unclear or unrelated. 0, no attempt. Okay, let's look down at the next 2 rows. The next 2 rows are establish argument and then select and use evidence. For a 6, it says the response's line of reasoning is logically organized and well developed. The commentary explains evidence and connects it to claims to clearly, convincingly establish an argument. There we can see there are going to be claims, you're going to use evidence, and that is going to establish your argument. That should remind you of part A, right? Evidence that leads to claims that establishes an argument, our table. Okay, number 4, the argument is mostly clear and organized, but the logic may be faulty or the reasoning may be logical but not well organized. The commentary explains links between evidence and claims. So there's still linking of evidence and claims, but the organization, the argumentation, your reasoning, there's some faults here that start to take away from your effect. That's a 4. A 2, the response's line of reasoning is disorganized or illogical. Maybe you're actually contradicting yourself. The commentary incorrectly or tangentially explains links between evidence and claims. That's a 2. Okay, what about select and use evidence? Let's look at a 6 to start. The response appropriately synthesizes relevant information drawn from at least 2 of the provided sources to develop and support a compelling argument. Look at number 4. To score a 4, it says the response accurately uses relevant information from at least 2 of the provided sources to support an argument. Okay, you gotta use at least 2 to get a 4 or a 6. The big difference here is if you look at the 6, it says compelling argument, appropriately synthesizes. So it's just adding this degree of complexity. All right, now a 2 is the response repeats or misinterprets the information from at least 2 of the provided sources, or the information lacks relevance, thereby providing little support for the argument. Notice that 2, 4, and 6 all say at least 2. If you don't want to do well on this row, don't use 2. You got to use 2. To even score the 2, there has to be at least 2 pieces used. So that tells you that there's got to be some length here, and you're going to have to know how to use at least 2 of these sources. Okay, last but not least, also worth 6 points is applying conventions. Here is a 6. The response communicates clearly to the reader, although may not be free of errors and grammar and style. How generous. You can still get a 6 with a couple misspellings or problems. And the response effectively integrates material from the sources. It is clearly introduced, integrated, embedded in the text, and accurately attributes knowledge and ideas. Accurately attributes. So in other words, you've shown your grader, you know how to use a source. You set it up. The hamburger, you introduce who it's coming from, the meat, that's maybe a quote or a paraphrase, and then some analysis. Make an evidence sandwich. That's what they're looking for here. Okay, number 4. The response is generally clear but contains some flaws and style with grammar that occasionally interfere with communication. Sometimes the reader's going to be like, I didn't get it. And the response accurately attributes knowledge and ideas. In other words, they know you're taking it from someplace. It's clear you're using evidence. Okay, number 2. The response contains many flaws in grammar and style that often interfere, or the response incorrectly or ineffectively attributes knowledge. So basically, you're not citing correctly, or it's just a hot mess. I'm an AP grader. Sometimes I have to give it 2. I'm like, I don't know what they're saying. So clarity is important here. All right, let's look at this example. And here, the first thing I want to do is I want to count paragraphs. 1, 2. Oh no, that's all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so 1 intro, clearly a conclusion, therefore. Notice how in their intro, they even underline the thesis. And then that, of course, leaves us with something like 4 to 5 paragraphs. All right. We are, again, not writing poetry here. We want to make sure our claims are easily discernible and easily laid out. The first claim, yada, yada, yada. Okay, let's look at their thesis and then we'll move on. So in this year, a lot of the sources had to deal with fast food, had to do with food production. So there's this theme of sort of food and sustainability weaving throughout these sources. Here's what they said. In comparing the current pros and cons of fast food versus independent restaurants, and in considering the economic and societal implications of outside intervention, it is clear that farmer subsistation could significantly increase the availability of healthy foods in America. I love it. It's so concrete. Provide subsidies to farmers to produce healthier food. So the government the impactor should do action, provide subsidies to the impacted and other stakeholder farmers in order to healthier food, the outcome. Impactor should do action, unimpacted in order to outcome. Those are your building blocks of an effective and clear argument. All right, that is part B. 90 minutes to put that together. This is the last thing between you and the exit door to AP Seminar. You've hopefully already got your things submitted, and this is that 45% that's going to take you over the edge here. I hope you found this helpful. There are, again, materials that I use with my students in the link in the bio. If you'd like to take a look at those may be useful for you in preparing for this, or if you're a teacher who's just looking to try to understand this exam better, I highly recommend checking out my unit on the end of your exam and just looking at across the board what to do throughout the year. All right, well, I have another video coming out soon about what to do after the exam if you still have time, but this is your main focus now, is get ready for that AP exam. I know you're gonna do well. You should study. In particular, look at the rubrics. Maybe rehearse some of the older tests, try it out. And then lastly, get good rest, because you're gonna have to write a lot and fast. Thanks so much for your time, and good luck in this lovely course that teaches you how to argue in a world full of arguments. Take care.